North Korea's latest nuclear test may have been its biggest so far, but its aggressive posturing makes a struggling economy that appears to be getting even worse. Our Asha Sukri takes a closer look.
From a distance, North Korea's capital, Pyongyang, looks like a modern, functional city. Its residents can now buy some of the things people in the West have long taken for granted. This chain of shops opened last year, selling everything from frozen fish to washing up liquid and electronics, all at prices that many in the city can afford.
We
thought that if we're selling the things that people need in everyday life and our opening hours are longer than other shops, our prices are reasonable and we provide guaranteed quality, then people would like it. That's why we started this business.
But even as the communist government tinkers with limited market-based reforms, it's been keeping up a more tried and tested way of making money. This week, it's launched a series of medium-range missiles and carried out a fifth nuclear test, its biggest one to date.
Our scientists and technicians of the Nuclear Weapons Institute carried out a nuclear explosion test at the Northern Nuclear Test Ground to check power of a nuclear warhead.
For decades, the ruling Kim family has ratcheted up its military posture before eventually easing back in return for Western aid. But there are signs that North Korea may now be getting more desperate for outside help. In March, state media warned North Koreans that they may have to go on what it called an arduous march and again have to eat the roots of grass. It was a reference to the devastating famines of the mid-1990s, in which hundreds of thousands, some say millions of people died. Last month, neighbouring South Korea's central bank said the North's economy was most likely shrinking at its quickest pace in 8 years, and its GDP had probably contracted by 1.1%. But as the Chinese economy has slowed down, so has its demand for raw materials from North Korea. And Western sanctions have made it increasingly difficult for North Korea to export the few goods that it makes. So with the US and UN promising even tougher sanctions following Pyongyang's latest moves, ordinary North Koreans may have to face even more hardship in the near future. Azhar Sukri, TRT World.
And Azhar joins me right here in the studio for more. Azhar, so after the last nuclear test back in January, you had the United Nations blacklist several companies and organizations from the North. They've restricted cargo going out of the country and restricted luxury goods coming into the country. And now you have Friday's test. What more can the world do?
Well, the next possible step could be what's called secondary sanctions. So in other words, the US could go after perhaps the banks and companies and even ports that deal with North Korea. So, for example, you could have a situation where banks are frozen out of the international payment mechanism, things like the SWIFT mechanism, for example. This was something that the US did quite successfully with Iran, and it has a very crippling effect on the economy and their ability to trade with the outside world. And in the case of Iran, it actually has been credited with forcing them back to the negotiating table.
But in North Korea's case, one could argue the case that the sanctions haven't worked and will not work.
Yeah, and a lot of that is kind of down to China, really. China, as we mentioned there, is the big benefactor of North Korea on the international stage. In the recent months, China has actually gotten a little bit tougher with North Korea. It actually closed down one of the banks near the Chinese-North Korean border. It froze some of their payments. But look, the international community says there's a lot more that China could do. It's still buying iron ore and coal from North Korea. It's still selling them oil. So there's still a lot of trade going on between those two. And that's helping to facilitate the nuclear program. But there's the counter-argument that sanctions themselves actually cripple the very people, the poorest people in North Korea who need the most help.
All right, Asha Sukri, thank you very much for that analysis.